My sister loomed in the doorway, my toddler anchored to her hip like a shield. "I won't allow a lunatic to poison my perfect child," she hissed, her voice a jagged blade of contempt. Clutching my toddler against her with a white-knuckled ferocity, she stepped back into the shadows, her eyes declaring a war I was never meant to win. I was standing in my bathroom at 2 in the morning when severe postpartum psychosis broke my grip on reality. That was 8 months ago. The walls were physically breathing, pulsing in and out like a lung, and a dark, invasive voice I couldn't silence was screaming that the ceiling was going to collapse on my 6-month-old daughter Lily. In a moment of pure, terrifying clarity, I bundled her into her car seat, drove to the emergency room, and begged the triage nurse to take her. I checked myself into a psychiatric ward on October 12th. Before they took my shoelaces and my phone, I called my older sister, Renata. I was sobbing hysterically, pleading with her to pick up Lily from the hospital social worker, a tired man named Stellan who kept looking at me with deep, pitying eyes. I told Renata I just needed to get my medication right, just a few intense months to heal my brain. She promised me she had it handled. She told me to rest. Then the heavy metal doors closed, and I vanished from the world. For 8 months, I fought my way back to sanity in a residential facility in upstate New York. I swallowed bitter pills from tiny paper cups. I sat in molded plastic chairs and talked until my throat bled about the delusions, peeling them back layer by layer until I could finally see the floor again. I foolishly believed Renata was holding down the fort. What I didn't know was that Renata wasn't acting as a temporary aunt. She was playing out a fantasy. 2 years prior, Renata's husband had emptied their joint accounts and fled the country, leaving her drowning in $65,000 of debt and shattering her dreams of starting a family. She was bitter, isolated, and deeply jealous of my life. When I went away, she saw a perfectly blank canvas. She moved out of her cramped studio apartment and used my pre-signed emergency blank checks, the ones I left for Lily's expenses, to rent a townhouse in a wealthy, gated zip code. She systematically erased my entire existence. She threw away the handmade quilts I had lovingly sewn for Lily. She stopped calling her Lily entirely, exclusively using her middle name Grace. She told all the new neighbors that she was a brave widow who lost her husband in a tragic accident, raising her infant alone. She aggressively blocked my weekly calls to her cell, legally instructing my doctors that hearing my voice was causing the baby extreme distress and actively hindering my recovery process. They believed her. She was the sane sister on the outside. I was the patient with the broken brain. By June 18th, I was officially discharged. My mind was clear, my medication was balanced, and my only driving thought was holding my little girl again. I took a Greyhound bus straight to the new address she had vaguely provided in her only email. I knocked on the heavy oak front door, my heart hammering against my ribs. Renata opened it, wearing a matching floral apron with my toddler on her hip. She didn't drop her warm smile, and she didn't look the least bit shocked to see me standing there. "You are trespassing on private property," she whispered, her voice dangerously calm and steady. "Grace is finally thriving here. She has a wealthy preschool lined up for the fall, top-tier pediatricians who absolutely adore me, and a stable mother who doesn't check herself into an asylum because things got a little tough. You are a biological danger, and I will not let a crazy person infect my perfect child." I violently pushed past her into the immaculate, sunlit living room, screaming desperately for my daughter. I reached out and grabbed Lily's little arm, but she shrank back in horror, terrified of the loud, crying stranger invading her home. "She's mine," I sobbed, falling to my knees on the pristine carpet. "I'm her mother, Renata. I got better for her." Renata calmly walked over to her sleek mahogany desk and opened the top drawer. She didn't threaten to call the police to remove me. She didn't argue about sisterly loyalty or morality. Instead, she tossed a thick, spiral-bound legal dossier onto the glass coffee table with a heavy thud. "You haven't contributed a single dime to her care in over 8 months," Renata said, her eyes dead and utterly cold. "In this state, that constitutes legal, undeniable abandonment. I hired an aggressive private investigator to document your entire time in the ward, including obtaining sworn affidavits from the night nurses about your violent hallucinations during your initial intake." I stared at the terrifying pile of paper, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I was sick, I choked out, tears blurring my vision. I left her at the hospital to protect her. Renata smiled, a thin, predatory line across her face. "And I protected her from you." She tapped the glossy cover of the dossier. "This isn't a threat or a negotiation. It's a finalized court order. A family judge permanently terminated your parental rights on Tuesday morning. You didn't show up to the hearing because I purposefully mailed the legal summons to your old, vacant apartment. I am Grace's legal, permanent mother now." I dropped my head onto her expensive rug, my rebuilt mind fracturing all over again. I looked up at the little girl clutching Renata's leg, and Lily just buried her face in her new mother's apron. "If you don't leave my house in exactly 30 seconds, Renata said, her tone conversational, "I am going to press this panic button. The police in this neighborhood respond in 3 minutes. And given your documented psychiatric history, where do you think they'll take you?" I stood up. My legs felt like they were moving through wet cement. I didn't say another word. I walked out the heavy oak door, down the manicured flagstone path, and out through the wrought iron gates of the subdivision. The summer sun was blinding. I had $50 in my pocket, a duffel bag of clothes from the hospital, and no child. I spent the first night in a motel off the interstate. The AC unit rattled violently against the window. I didn't sleep. I sat cross-legged on the faded floral bedspread, staring at the wall, mentally replaying the exact wording on the cover of that dossier. In Ray, termination of parental rights, minor child, Grace. She had legally erased Lily. The next morning, I walked 2 miles to the county courthouse. The air was already thick with humidity. I bypassed the metal detectors, my heart beating a frantic rhythm in my throat, and found the family court clerk's office on the 3rd floor. The woman behind the plexiglass looked exhausted. Her name tag said Imogen. "I need to see a file," I said, my voice barely more than a rasp. "My sister filed for custody. My daughter's name is Lily, or Grace." Grace, I gave her Renata's last name. Imogen clicked her mouse a few times, her eyes scanning the monitor. "Ah, default judgment. Signed by Judge Trask 3 days ago." She printed out a stack of papers and slid them through the the slot at the bottom of the glass. Here's the public record. You want certified copies? It's $1 a page. I took the papers. I sat on a wooden bench in the hallway and read through them. It was a masterpiece of legal manipulation. Renata had filed an affidavit claiming she didn't know my exact whereabouts, only that I was transient and suffering from severe addiction and mental health crises. Because she swore she couldn't locate me, the judge allowed her to serve me by publication, meaning she just had to run a tiny legal notice in a local newspaper nobody reads, and by mailing a copy to my last known address, the apartment I had been evicted from 4 months into my hospital stay. She had used the money she drained from my accounts to pay the retainer for a high-end family law firm. They had steamrolled the court. Because I didn't show up to contest it, the judge took Renata's narrative as absolute truth. I was an unfit, dangerous, absent mother. Renata was the savior. I needed a lawyer. I walked down the street to a legal aid clinic housed in a brick building that smelled of damp cardboard and stale coffee. I waited 3 hours in a plastic chair until a man named Jasper finally called my name. He was in his 50s, wearing a rumpled shirt with the sleeves rolled up. I laid the court printouts on his desk. I explained the hospitalization, the postpartum psychosis, the 8 months of recovery, and what happened at the townhouse. I talked fast, terrified he would think I was crazy, terrified he would look at me the way Renata did. Jasper read the paperwork in silence. He rubbed his temples. I'm going to be straight with you, Jasper said, leaning back in his creaking chair. This is a nightmare. Terminating parental rights is the civil equivalent of the death penalty. It is permanent. Judges don't do it lightly, but your sister painted a picture of total abandonment, backed by medical records of a severe psychiatric break, and you didn't show up to object. She hid the summons. I hit the desk with my palm. She knew exactly where I was. She was actively telling my doctors to block my calls. Proving that is going to take time and money, Jasper said gently. We have to file a motion to vacate the default judgment based on extrinsic fraud. We have to prove she lied to the court about not knowing your whereabouts. But here's the hard truth. Even if we get the default thrown out, we just go back to square one. A custody battle. And she has a massive advantage. She has the house, the money, the stability. You have no job, no home, and a fresh discharge from a psych ward. The court looks at the best interest of the child. Right now, on paper, that's her. It's my money, I said, my voice shaking. She used my emergency checks to fund all of this. Can you prove it was unauthorized? Jasper asked. You signed them. For Lily's diapers. Not for a luxury townhouse and a private investigator. Jasper sighed. We have exactly 30 days from the date the judgment was entered to file the motion to vacate. We have 27 days left. I can help you with the filings pro bono, but you need to get a job. You need to rent a room. You need to look impeccably stable. And you cannot go near that house again. If she gets a restraining order against you, this is over. Do you understand me? I nodded slowly. The sheer scale of the mountain in front of me was suffocating. I left Jasper's office and stood on the hot pavement. I needed an ally. I pulled out my phone and dialed the only person I thought might listen. My cousin Nadia. She had always been the peacemaker in the family. She had come to my baby shower. She had held Lily when she was born. The phone rang 4 times before she picked up. Hello? Nadia, it's me, I said, my voice breaking. I'm out. I'm discharged. There was a long, terrible silence on the line. Nadia, are you there? I'm here, she said. Her voice was flat, tight. I didn't think you'd call. Renata said you were probably going to bounce to another state. What? No, I'm here. I went to her house to get Lily. Nadia, she stole her. She faked court documents to take my rights away. I need your help. I need a place to stay just for a few weeks until I can get on my feet. Nadia exhaled loudly. Look, don't do this. Don't drag me into your delusions. The word hit me like a physical blow. Delusions? Nadia, I'm fully medicated. I have a clean bill of health. I'm sane. Are you? Nadia's voice hardened. Because Renata has been holding our family together for 8 months. She stepped up when you completely lost your mind and abandoned that little girl. Do you know what she's been through? The colicky nights, the pediatrician visits. Grace is happy. She calls Renata mama. We had a barbecue last Sunday. Grace was laughing in the sprinkler. Her name is Lily. I screamed into the phone, losing the grip I had sworn to Jasper I would keep. See, this is exactly what Renata was talking about. Nadia snapped. You're unstable. You're dangerous. Renata warned us you might show up and try to cause a scene. Do not call me again. Leave them alone, or I will testify for Renata myself. The line went dead. I stood on the corner of Main and 4th, the afternoon traffic rushing past me in a blur of metal and exhaust. Renata hadn't just taken my child. She had rewritten the history of our entire family. She had built a fortress of lies, and she was sitting comfortably inside it while I stood on the outside with nothing. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling, but not from psychosis. It was rage. Cold, sharp, and perfectly sane. I had 27 days. I started walking. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay on that corner. I had $50. That was my entire net worth. I found a women's shelter on the edge of the industrial district just as the sun started to dip below the factory rooftops. The building was cinderblock, painted appealing, institutional yellow. The woman at the intake desk had a name tag that read Hester. She didn't look up from her clipboard when I asked for a bed. She just handed me a plastic bin for my clothes and pointed down a long hallway that smelled intensely of bleach and old soup. Curfew is 8 p.m., Hester said, her voice flat. You miss it, you lose the bed. Lights out at 9. No drugs, no alcohol, no screaming. Breakfast is at 6. You're out on the street by 7 so we can clean. I took the bin. The shelter was a cavernous room filled with 40 metal cots, spaced exactly 2 feet apart. I found an empty one in the corner, sat down, and put my face in my hands. Jasper's words echoed in my head. You need a job. You need to rent a room. You need to look impeccably stable. I was sitting on a squeaking cot in a homeless shelter with a garbage bag of clothes. If the judge saw me now, he'd probably sign the termination papers a second time just to be sure. I didn't sleep. The room was a symphony of coughing, restless shifting, and the occasional muffled sob. At 6 in the morning, the fluorescent lights snapped on with a loud electronic hum. By 7:15, I was walking down a commercial strip lined with auto body shops and discount furniture stores. I went into every business with a help wanted sign in the window. A bakery, a dry cleaner, a hardware store. Every time it was the same story. They handed me an application. I stared at the section for recent employment history. I had an 8-month gap. Before the hospital, I had been a freelance graphic designer, working from home while Lily slept. But my laptop was gone, probably in a landfill along with the quilts I'd made for her. I couldn't put down psychiatric ward resident as my most recent job. I left the lines blank. The managers took one look at the incomplete forms, gave me a tight smile, and said they'd keep me on file. At 2 in the afternoon, my stomach cramping from hunger, I walked into a greasy spoon diner called the Brass Kettle. It smelled like burnt coffee and frying onions. A man with a stained apron and a dark, receding hairline was wiping down the counter. I need a job, I said. I didn't ask for an application. I just looked him in the eye. He stopped wiping. You have waitress experience? No, I said. But I can wash dishes, scrub floors, take out trash. I'll do whatever you need, and I'll do it better than whoever just quit. I just need cash. He studied me for a long moment. His name was Arlo, according to the whiteboard in the kitchen. Minimum wage, Arlo grunted. Under the table. You drop a plate, it comes out of your pay. Shift is 3 to midnight. You start right now. Thank you, I said, my voice cracking slightly. I spent the next 9 hours standing over a steaming industrial sink, scrubbing baked-on grease off heavy ceramic plates. The hot water blistered my hands, and the constant smell of discarded food made my empty stomach churn. But I didn't stop moving. Every plate was a fraction of a dollar. Every dollar was a step closer to Jasper's definition of stable. At midnight, Arlo handed me $65 in crumpled bills. The next morning, I had $75 in my pocket. I skipped breakfast at the shelter and walked 3 miles to the downtown branch of my old bank. I needed to see exactly what Renata had done. The branch manager was a young guy named Thad, wearing a suit that looked one size too big. He sat me down in his glass-walled office and pulled up my account history. I need to see the cleared checks from October to June, I told him. Thad tapped his keyboard, frowning at his monitor. Your account was closed in April due to a zero balance, but I can pull the archived statements. He printed off a small stack of paper and slid it across the desk. I scanned the rows of numbers. On October 14th, 2 days after I checked into the hospital, a check cleared for $6,000, then another in November for $4,000, then December, another $5,000. Can I see the digital scans of these checks? I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. Thad clicked his mouse. A scanned image of a check popped up on his screen. It was one of the emergency checks I had left in the kitchen drawer. I had pre-signed 5 of them. Renata had filled in the payee line. She hadn't written them out to herself. She had written them out to cash. She drained it, I whispered. $62,000. My entire life savings. And she did it in cash withdrawals, so there's no paper trail of where it went. Ma'am, if these checks were stolen, we have a fraud department. I signed them. I interrupted, staring blankly at the screen. I left them for emergencies. For my daughter. Thad grimaced sympathetically. If you signed them, and she was an authorized holder, there's very little the bank can do. It's a civil matter at this point. I kept scrolling through the printed statements. Most of the money was gone by February, but then I saw a line item from late March that wasn't a check. It was an AIC transfer, a direct electronic payment. What is this one? I pointed to a charge for $12,500. Thad looked closer. That was a wire transfer to an LLC. Let me check the routing data. He typed for a minute. It went to an account registered to a business called Trask and Farrow LP. Looks like a law firm. I felt the blood drain from my face. Trask, the judge who signed the termination order, was named Trask. I remembered Jasper mentioning that Renata hired a high-end family law firm to steamroll the court. She used my money, I said, the realization sinking in like a stone in my stomach. She used my life savings to pay the retainer for the lawyers who terminated my parental rights. It was perfectly legal and completely devastating. She had engineered my destruction using the very funds I had saved to protect Lily's future. I walked out of the bank feeling like I had been kicked in the chest. I found a payphone outside a convenience store, a relic that barely worked, and fed it 3 of my hard-earned quarters. I dialed the main number for the psychiatric facility in upstate New York. I needed the call logs. I needed to prove to Jasper and the court that Renata had called the ward, that she had spoken to my doctors, that she knew exactly where I was when she swore to a judge I was missing. A woman answered on the 3rd ring. Records department, this is Sable. Hi, Sable. I was a patient there until last week. I need my complete medical file, specifically the visitor logs and the incoming call records for the nurses station on Ward C. Okay, I can help you with that, Sable said, her voice dripping with bureaucratic boredom. I just need you to go to our website, download the HIPAA release form, fill it out, get it notarized, and mail it to us with a copy of your government-issued ID. I don't have internet access right now, I pleaded. Can you just look it up? I can give you my patient ID number. I just need to know if the logs exist. I'm sorry, ma'am, but I cannot confirm or deny any patient information over the phone without a notarized release on file. It's federal law. Please. My sister stole my baby. I just need the logs to prove she knew I was there. I have 25 days to file a motion. Ma'am, Sable's tone turned icy. If you don't lower your voice, I will disconnect this call. You need to mail the form. How long does it take once you get the form? I asked, my throat tight. Standard processing time for medical records is 14 to 21 business days from the date of receipt. Sable replied. 21 days? I gripped the heavy plastic receiver. If I mailed it tomorrow, it might take a week to get there. Add 21 days of processing, plus mailing it back. The 30-day window to appeal the court order would be slammed shut. Is there any way to expedite it? I begged. Can I pay a rush fee? No, Sable said simply. We process them in the order they are received. Have a good day. The line clicked and went dead. I slowly placed the heavy plastic receiver back on its metal hook. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood there on the hot concrete, staring at the scratched plexiglass of the phone booth, doing the math in my head. 25 days. A notarized letter would take 2 days to get there. 21 days to process. Another 2 days to mail back. That was 25 days exactly. Assuming nobody took a long lunch. Assuming the mail didn't get delayed. Assuming Sable wasn't holding a grudge about my tone. It was a gamble I couldn't afford to lose, but it was the only play I had. I needed a notary. I needed postage. I needed to get back to the diner before 3, so Arlo didn't fire me. I walked the 3 miles back to the industrial strip. My cheap sneakers were wearing thin at the heels, sending sharp shocks up my calves with every step. I found a check cashing place wedged between a liquor store store, and a pawn shop. They had a cardboard sign in the window. Notary public $5. I walked in, paid $1 to print the hospital's HIPAA release form from their public terminal, filled it out with a blue pen chained to the counter, and handed over 5 of my remaining dollars to a bored guy named Bowen who stamped it without even looking at my ID. I bought a padded envelope and a priority stamp. By the time I dropped it in the blue mailbox on the corner, I was down to $58. I made it to the brass kettle with 4 minutes to spare. Arlo tossed me a fresh, stiff apron. Busboy didn't show. You're clearing tables today, not just washing. Keep the coffee hot. Don't talk to the regulars unless they talk to you. I nodded. I spent the next 9 hours in a blur of motion, wiping down sticky vinyl booths, carrying plastic tubs full of half-eaten eggs and soggy toast, pouring endless streams of black coffee into thick ceramic mugs. My body ached in ways I didn't know were possible. The psychiatric ward had made me soft. 8 months of structured sitting, group therapy, and scheduled naps had completely eroded my stamina. But every time my knees buckled, every time my lower back screamed, I thought about Renata's cold, dead eyes. I thought about the $62,000. I thought about Lily burying her face in that floral apron. I worked until midnight. Arlo handed me $70. You missed a spot under table 4. He grunted. Don't make it a habit. I walked back to the shelter in the dark. I made curfew by 10 minutes. Hester checked my name off the clipboard with a heavy sigh. I crawled into my cot, my clothes smelling like old bacon grease, and clutched my thin blanket. I closed my eyes and tried to picture Lily's face, but all I could see was the bank statement. Trask and Farrow LP. The next morning, I was waiting on the steps of the legal aid clinic when Jasper unlocked the front door at 8 a.m. He looked surprised to see me, holding a cardboard tray with 2 coffees. You're early, he said, juggling his keys. I have proof, I told him. He ushered me inside. The smell of damp brick and cheap coffee grounds instantly familiar. We went into his cramped office. I slapped the printed bank statements down on his cluttered desk. Look at the dates, I said, pointing at the rows of numbers. She drained my account. Over $60,000 in cash withdrawals. But look at this one. March 28. Jasper leaned in, putting on a pair of reading glasses he pulled from his shirt pocket. He traced his finger along the line item. OC transfer. $12,500. He read the payee name. Trask and Farrow LP. He stopped moving. He stared at the paper for a long time. Jasper? I prompted. That's the law firm she hired, right? And the judge who signed the termination order, his name was Trask. Jasper took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He let out a long, slow breath. William Trask, Jasper said, his voice quiet. The judge. He was a founding partner of Trask and Farrow 25 years ago. He stepped down to take the bench, but his son, Emerson Trask, is the managing partner there now. So he gave his son's firm a free pass? I asked, my voice rising. He just rubber-stamped my sister stealing my baby because she paid his son with my money? Keep your voice down, Jasper warned, glancing at his closed office door. It's not a conspiracy. It's just the reality of local family court. It's a small pool. Judges hear cases from their former firms all the time, but the law requires them to recuse themselves if there's a direct financial conflict of interest or an appearance of impropriety. If Renata paid Emerson Trask and Judge Trask signed the default judgment without disclosing the relationship to the record, that's our wedge. So we can throw out the judgment? It gives us a much stronger argument for the motion to vacate, Jasper corrected. We argue extrinsic fraud on the service of process, that she hid the summons, and we add a judicial conflict of interest. It's aggressive. It will piss off the judge, and it will definitely piss off the firm. I don't care who it pisses off. Violet. Jasper looked at me, his expression softening slightly. You look terrible. Where are you sleeping? A women's shelter on 9th. I got a job washing dishes at a diner. Jasper nodded slowly. Okay, that's a start. I will draft the motion today. But here is the next hurdle. We have to serve Renata with a copy of this motion and a subpoena for her financial records. Real service. A process server has to physically hand the papers to her. We can't just mail it. I know where she lives, I said instantly. I can go there. Absolutely not, Jasper said, his voice hardening. You cannot go within a mile of that house. If she claims you're harassing her, she gets a restraining order, and you lose any chance of showing the court you are stable. We have to hire a professional process server, and they aren't free. How much? I asked, my stomach tightening. Standard rate is $150. For a gated community where they have to be sneaky, maybe $200. I thought about the crumpled bills in my pocket. I had just over $100 left. I'll get it, I said, standing up. Draft the motion. I'll bring you the cash on Friday. I left the clinic feeling a strange, sharp sense of purpose. I wasn't just a crazy woman yelling into the void anymore. I had a target. I had a strategy. I spent the next 3 days living in a state of absolute deprivation. I ate nothing but the leftover scraps Arlo let me take from the diner kitchen. Half a cold pancake, a bruised apple, a handful of stale fries. I walked everywhere to save bus fare. I washed my only set of clothes in the sink at the shelter and dried them under the hand dryer in the public library bathroom. Every dollar I made went straight into a folded envelope inside my shoe. By Thursday night, I had $210. I was exhausted. My hands were permanently pruned and smelling of industrial soap, but I had the money. I was wiping down the counter at 11:30, mentally rehearsing what I was going to say to Jasper the next morning. When the bell above the diner door jingled, I looked up. A woman walked in. She was wearing a sleek camel trench coat that looked completely out of place in the brass kettle. She had perfectly blown out blonde hair and expensive leather boots. It was my cousin, Nadia. I froze, the dirty rag slipping from my fingers. She stood just inside the doorway, her eyes scanning the empty booths before landing on me behind the counter. She didn't look angry. She looked deeply uncomfortable. Arlo was in the back, scraping the grill. We were alone in the front. Nadia walked slowly toward the counter. She stopped on the other side of the sticky linoleum, looking at my greasy apron, my raw hands, my hollow cheeks. I could see the pity forming in her eyes, and I hated her for it. What are you doing here, Nadia? I asked. My voice was raspy from not speaking to anyone but Arlo all day. Renata's private investigator tracked you down, Nadia said quietly. She kept her hands buried deep in her coat pockets. He pulled your employment record somehow. Or maybe he just asked around the shelters. I don't know. My blood ran cold. She had someone following me? She's just being careful, Nadia said, defending her instantly, out of habit. She wanted to know if you were actually staying in the city. or if you were moving on. I'm staying, I said, leaning closer to the counter. I'm fighting her. Nadia, I have a lawyer. I have proof she stole my money to pay for her attorneys. Nadia closed her eyes and shook her head, a tight, dismissive gesture. Stop it. Just stop. I didn't come here to argue with you about your delusions. They aren't delusions. I hit the counter with my open palm. The sharp smack echoed in the empty diner. Arlo's head popped out from the kitchen pass, his eyes narrowing, but he went back to the grill. I lowered my voice to a harsh whisper. Why are you here? Nadia reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out a thick white envelope and set it on the counter between us. It looked heavy. Renata asked me to give you this, Nadia said. She wouldn't look me in the eye anymore. It's $5,000 in cash. I stared at the envelope. It felt like a trap. Why? It's a relocation fund, Nadia said carefully, reciting words she had clearly been told to say. She knows you're struggling. She knows the shelters are unsafe. She wants you to have a fresh start. You can take this, buy a bus ticket anywhere you want, get a nice apartment, and get back on your feet. And the catch? I asked, my voice dangerously flat. Nadia finally looked up. Her eyes were wet. You have to sign a non-disclosure agreement and a permanent no-contact order. You take the money, you leave the state, and you never ever contact Renata or Grace again. Her name is Lily, I whispered, feeling the rage bubbling up into my throat. She stole my child, she stole $60,000 from me, and now she's trying to buy me off with $5,000 of my own money? She's trying to be kind. Nadia pleaded, her voice cracking. She doesn't want you to be homeless. She just wants peace for her family. Please, just take it. You can't win against her. She has the house, she has the lawyers, she has the stability. If you take her back to court, they will drag your medical records through the mud. They will make you look like a monster. Do you want that on public record? Do you want Grace to grow up and read those court transcripts? I want my daughter back, I said. I picked up the heavy envelope. Nadia let out a relieved sigh, thinking I had accepted it. I stepped out from behind the counter. I walked over to the trash can by the front door, the one filled with coffee grounds, wet napkins, and half-eaten eggs. I held the envelope over it and tore it cleanly in half. Nadia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. I tore it again, ripping the thick stack of $100 bills into quarters. I dropped the shredded money into the wet garbage. Tell Renata I have a lawyer, I said, walking back to the door and pulling it open. The cool night air rushed in. Tell her I know about Judge Trask, and tell her I'll see her in court. Nadia stared at the trash can in absolute horror. She looked at me like I was a wild animal. She didn't say another word. She turned and practically ran out of the diner, her expensive boots clicking sharply against the pavement. I closed the door and locked it. I walked back behind the counter and picked up my dirty rag. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I had just destroyed $5,000. It was more money than I had seen in 8 months. It could have bought me a clean bed, a hot shower, a safe room, but taking it meant disappearing. And I wasn't going to vanish for her again. You okay? Arlo asked, stepping out from the kitchen. He had a grease-stained towel slung over his shoulder. He looked at the torn envelope in the trash. I'm fine, I said, scrubbing a spot on the counter that was already clean. Arlo grunted. Your shift is over. Go home. I grabbed my coat and walked out into the night. It was late. The buses had stopped running. I had to walk the 3 miles back to the shelter in the dark. I got to the cinder block building at 12:45. The heavy metal door was locked. I knocked. A minute later, a small sliding panel opened, and Hester's tired face appeared behind a metal grate. Curfew is 8 p.m., Hester said, her voice devoid of any emotion. I know. I'm sorry, I pleaded, shivering in the cool air. I had a family emergency at work. It won't happen again. Please. My stuff is in my bin. Rules are rules, Hester said. You miss curfew, you lose the bed. We gave it to someone else an hour ago. Come back at 7 tomorrow. You can collect your bin. The panel slid shut with a sharp, metallic clack. I stood on the concrete steps, the realization washing over me. I had nowhere to go. I had $210 in my shoe, meant for a process server, and nowhere to sleep. I turned around and started walking down the empty industrial street. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, broken shadows on the pavement. I found an all-night laundromat 2 blocks down. It was violently bright inside, smelling of cheap detergent and fabric softener. A few exhausted people were slumped in molded plastic chairs, waiting for their clothes to dry. I walked to the very back, wedged myself into the narrow space between a humming dryer and the wall, and pulled my knees to my chest. The metal side of the machine was warm against my back. I closed my eyes. I had 21 days left. The hum of the dryer eventually stopped, leaving the laundromat in a thick, fluorescent silence. I woke up stiff, my neck aching, but the first thing I did was reach into my shoe. The folded envelope was still there, $210. At 7 a.m., I walked back to the shelter, stood in the alley by the dumpsters, and waited for Hester to bring out the trash. When she did, I asked for my plastic bin. I changed my clothes behind a brick wall, threw the grease-stained diner uniform into a commercial dumpster, and started the long walk to the legal aid clinic. Jasper was unlocking his office door when I walked in. I didn't say good morning. I just pulled the folded envelope out of my shoe, smoothed out the damp, crumpled bills on his desk, and pushed them toward him. $210, I said. Hire the process server. File it today. Jasper looked at the money, then up at my face. He didn't ask where I got it or where I slept last night. He just nodded, pulled a thick stack of stapled paper from his outbox, and picked up his desk phone. He called a guy named Caden. Within an hour, a heavy-set man in a faded polo shirt walked into the clinic, took the paperwork and $150 of my dollars, and walked out. Now we wait, Jasper said, sliding the remaining $60 back across the desk. Get something to eat. Get a bed. Come back here on Monday morning. I spent the weekend in a cheap single-room occupancy hotel above a pawn shop. It cost $40 a night. It had a mattress that smelled like stale smoke and a sink that dripped rust, but it had a door that locked from the inside. I slept for 14 hours straight. I bought a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter from a corner bodega, rationing it out over the next 2 days. On Monday morning, I sat in the hard plastic chair in Jasper's office. At 9:15, his phone rang. He put it on speaker. It was a lawyer named Dorian Wolfe. He was a senior partner at Trask and Farrow LP. His voice was clipped, tight, and barely concealing a deep, rising panic. Jasper, Wolfe said, we received your motion to vacate, and the Attached exhibits regarding the banking history. Morning, Dorian, Jasper said, leaning back in his chair. I imagine Emerson Trask is having a stressful Monday. There was a long pause on the line. Your allegations regarding the retainer funds are entirely circumstantial. Our firm performed standard due diligence. We had no reason to believe the client was not authorized to draft those checks. She drafted them to cash, Dorian, Jasper said, his voice dropping into a low, hard register. $62,000 in cash, which then magically wired into your firm's operating account. And you took that money to a judge who happens to be your managing partner's father to push through a default judgment by intentionally hiding the mother's location. You served my client by publication while she was actively locked in a psychiatric facility, which your client knew about, and which we have the phone logs to prove. My breath caught. I looked at Jasper. He covered the receiver with his hand and winked at me. He didn't have the phone logs. Sable hadn't sent them. He was bluffing, betting everything on the bank statements and the judge's name. What do you want, Jasper? Wolf finally asked. The client is not going to surrender custody of the minor child. She has established a stable, loving environment. I don't give a damn about her environment, Jasper fired back. Here is what is going to happen, Dorian. You are going to draft a consent order vacating the termination of parental rights. You are going to stipulate to my client's immediate, full legal and physical custody. You are going to have Renata sign it by noon tomorrow. If you don't, I file the motion with the clerk at 1 o'clock, and the second it hits the public docket, I am hand-delivering a copy to the State Bar Association's Ethics Committee and another copy to the Judicial Oversight Board. Your firm will be investigated for laundering stolen funds, and Judge Trask will be forced into early retirement in disgrace. The silence on the phone was so absolute I could hear the faint static of the line. We need a transition plan, Wolf said quietly. The fight was completely gone from his voice. You can't just rip a toddler out of the home. It's detrimental to the child. Mediation room 4, tomorrow at 10 a.m., Jasper said. Bring the consent order. Bring Renata. He hung up. I buried my face in my hands. The heavy, suffocating weight that had been crushing my chest for 8 months cracked, just a little. The next morning, I wore the cleanest clothes I had from the hospital duffel bag. Jasper walked with me into the courthouse, past the metal detectors, up to the 4th floor. Renata was already sitting at the long mahogany table in mediation room 4. She was wearing a tailored navy suit. Her hair was perfectly styled, but her hands were flat on the table, and her knuckles were bone white. Dorian Wolf sat next to her, looking exhausted. I sat across from her. I didn't look at the lawyer. I looked directly into my sister's eyes. They weren't cold and dead anymore. They were terrified. Wolf slid a thick stack of paper across the table. This is the consent order vacating the previous judgment. It establishes full custody for the biological mother, effective immediately. We have also included a stipulation that our client will return the remaining $22,000 of the contested funds to avoid civil litigation. Renata stared at me. You're going to ruin her, she whispered, her voice trembling. She has a life here. She has a preschool. You don't even have a home. You're a dishwasher. I quit, I said simply. You're sick, Renata hissed, leaning forward. You are deeply, fundamentally broken. You left her in an emergency room. I did, I said. My voice was steady. I didn't raise it. I didn't cry. I was sick, and I got help. I did the hardest thing a mother can possibly do, and I survived it. You aren't a mother, Renata. You're a thief playing house with stolen money. Renata flinched like I had struck her. She looked at her lawyer, desperate for him to intervene, to object, to defend her. Wolf just tapped a silver pen against the signature line on the document. Sign it, Renata, Wolf said, not looking at her. Or I withdraw as your counsel immediately. And you can explain the bank fraud to the district attorney yourself. Renata picked up the pen. Her hand shook so violently she could barely form the letters. She signed her name, pushed the paper back across the table, stood up, and walked out of the room without looking back. 3 days later, I stood on the flagstone path outside the heavy oak door of the townhouse. Jasper was standing next to me. A court-appointed social worker named Blythe was waiting on the porch. Renata opened the door. She looked hollowed out. She didn't have the floral apron on. Blythe stepped forward. We're here for the minor child. Renata turned and walked into the living room. A moment later, she came back, carrying Lily. My daughter was bigger. Her hair was longer, pulled back into a neat little braid. She was wearing an expensive smocked dress. She looked at me, her big brown eyes wide and uncertain. Renata held her out. I stepped forward and took her into my arms. Lily stiffened. She started to cry, squirming against my chest, reaching her little hands back toward Renata. Mama, she wailed. It was a physical agony, a sharp, twisting knife in my ribs, but I didn't let go. I held her firmly, resting my chin against the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair. It's okay, Lily, I whispered, rocking her gently. I've got you. Mama's got you. Renata stood in the doorway, tears streaming silently down her face, her empty arms hanging at her sides. Her fantasy was over. I turned around and walked down the driveway. I didn't look back. The $22,000 cleared my new bank account the following Tuesday. It wasn't the life savings I had before, but it was enough. I rented a small ground-floor, one-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood near a park. I bought a crib, a secondhand dining table, and a set of plastic blocks. The transition wasn't cinematic. It was hard, grinding work. Lily cried for Renata for the first 2 weeks. There were nights I sat on the floor of her bedroom, exhausted to my bones, wondering if the broken pieces of my mind were really strong enough to hold us both together. But then, on a rainy Tuesday in late August, I was sitting on the cheap rug in our living room, stacking blue and yellow blocks. Lily toddled over from the kitchen. She was holding a ragged, faded piece of fabric, one of the original quilts I had made her, which I found stuffed in the bottom of the duffel bag Renata had surrendered. Lily dropped the blanket on my lap, climbed up next to me, and rested her head heavily against my shoulder. Up, she demanded softly. I lifted her onto my lap. I wrapped my arms around her. The walls weren't breathing. The room was quiet. I was perfectly, unbreakably sane. And for the first time in nearly a year, I was finally home.